Thank you for joining this session on extreme heat, urban heat. It's an incredibly important topic, and we have a really good set of panelists today who will be discussing this topic in quite a bit of detail. I want to first thank the ADB for inviting the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center to co-lead this session on urban heat. My name is Amit Prothi. I'm a senior advisor at the Arsht Rock Center and bring 25 years of experience in urban development and urban planning. Our panel today includes three very, very talented, experienced professionals. We have Professor Rob Wilby, who's a hydroclimatologist and professor of hydroclimatic modeling in the Department of Geography and Environment at Loughborough University in the UK. We have Eleni Lenio-Mirivelli. She's the Athens and Europe's first chief heat officer and served as the deputy mayor for urban nature and climate resilience for the city between 2014 and 2019. And we have Vijay Brahmbhatt, who's the director of Mahila Housing Trust in India, and for over 20 years has worked in cities in the areas of formal, informal, and invisible governance for housing and habitat. Their bios are much, much more extensive, and all of you can go to the events page to see their bios. Before we start, I will do some housekeeping. You will see on the right side of the screen, there's a question and answer box, there's a chat box, and there's a feedback tab. Throughout the session, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. That's a constant. You can keep asking anytime you want, and you can actually chat with other members of the audience as well, so it can be a live discussion. You can like some of the questions that people have posted in the Q&A box, so at least as a moderator, I can see if there's one question that has 10 likes versus 5 likes. It gives me the ability to understand what might be more priority questions for all of you. Also on the left side of the screen is an activity feed where quote cards and insights will be posted all through this session. And also be advised that this session is being recorded. So why should we focus on urban heat? A recent IPCC report establishes that increases in greenhouse gas emissions since the 1970s, since the 1750s, have been caused by human activities. The last 4 decades have been successively warmer than any decade since 1850. And that hot extremes, including heat waves, have become more frequent and more intense since the 1950s. Other research indicates that by 2050, 1.6 billion people in 970 cities will face extreme heat conditions. We at the Arsht Rock Center recently produced a report with a leading economics research firm that found that extreme heat is causing an average of $100 billion in economic losses from reduced worker productivity in the US. And these losses could double by 2030 and continue to increase if meaningful mitigation and adaptation measures were not put in place. Most of us on this forum probably already recognize that the impact of extreme heat is felt disproportionately by the poor, the elderly, and those with compromised health conditions. When temperature and humidity rises, our body tries to regulate our internal temperature. But beyond certain thresholds, we start to experience fatigue, loss of concentration, and ultimately organ failure that can lead to death. Extreme heat has been described as a silent killer because we have not paid a lot of attention to it. Even now, we don't have a clear count of the morbidity and mortality rates associated with rising temperatures. But millions suffer, and more are likely to as global temperature continues to rise and cities continue to experience urban heat island effects where the temperature differential is even greater. Within this context, we at the Arsht Rock Center have chosen to focus our efforts to address this increasing global risk. There are 3 things I want to mention. We have established an extreme heat resilience alliance with partners from the scientific community, public health experts, resilience experts, policymakers, and cities, with a goal to protect lives and livelihoods from extreme urban heat and protecting the most vulnerable people and communities. We have just started to help cities and governments categorize and name heat waves. Several in Spain, California, in the US have started to think about categorizing and naming heat waves. Why? Because that can help to raise awareness of the threat that extreme heat poses to all of us. And the third thing I want to highlight is that we are working directly with champion cities. Athens in Europe is one of them. Freetown in Africa is another. Miami in North America is a third, where we're working directly with cities to identify measures to reduce vulnerability to extreme heat. Today, I'm really excited to hear from three people who have been engaged with three different dimensions of this topic for some time now. Rob will highlight the drivers behind the increasing heat exposure in Asian cities and some of the adaptation measures that could be pursued. Lenio will share how her position as Europe's first chief heat officer is helping to prioritize efforts to address the increasing heat risks in Athens. And Vijay will share the experience of our organization of working directly to improve the lives of residents, particularly women, who are facing the brunt of extreme heat in low-income communities. With that, I'll invite Rob to share his presentation. Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Now, it's rather early in the morning here, so before I forget, I just want to communicate the two key messages of my talk. And the first one is that the causes or the drivers of extreme heat operate over multiple scales, and the responses to heat should also be undertaken at very different scales, and they should be integrated. And the second key message is that we need to think of responses that involve engineering solutions as well as soft measures like plans and forecasting systems. So if you forget everything else I say, they're the two key messages I'd like to get across. So let me just move to the next slide. So we've just heard we're entering this era of very clear global warming. Some of you may appreciate that in July this year, the highest ever monthly global temperature was achieved. And this is part of a relentless ongoing trend of warming across the planet. But the key point to take away from this figure is that the land areas are warming much faster than the planet as a whole, and that the warming is not uniform everywhere. In fact, the tropics are particularly vulnerable to rises in temperature because that's also combining with the very high humidity. So we're thinking about the global warming as the backdrop to the rise in the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of heat waves across the planet. But regionally, there are other factors at play. So in Southeast Asia, we need to also consider the effect of the El Nino. So when that's reflecting positive temperature anomalies in the Pacific, we tend to see much higher temperatures in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia, parts of Pakistan and Northwest India. And this causes year-to-year variability in heat extremes, as we can see from the stripy pattern for Pakistan, where the red stripes denote the rising frequency of very hot years compared with the cooler years at the start of the record in the 1900s. So regionally, there's these factors at play that are superimposed upon the global mean trend, but at the city scale, we're also exacerbating temperatures by virtue of changing the land surface from green and blue spaces into impervious surfaces that absorb and give out a much greater amount of heat. At the neighborhoods and building scale, we're also putting additional heat into the environment through artificial sources from transport systems, heating, lighting, air conditioning, and so forth. And then coming right down to the human scale, what we actually experience in the urban environment depends very much on living and working environment, and the shade that we encounter, the amount of vegetation, the building type. So we need to think of all of those factors in a nested way as shaping the temperature extremes in the urban environment. And as Amit has already mentioned, we need to think of heat in terms of not just temperatures, but in terms of the combination of high temperature with high humidity. In fact, this graphic on the left-hand side is an incredible meta-analysis of some 900 deadly heat waves across the planet, where they worked out the combinations of temperature and humidity shown in the crosses that lead to lethal conditions. So you can see that at very high temperatures, you need relatively low humidities to cause very dangerous conditions. And the map on the right-hand side shows the parts of the world where we're already observing extreme humid heat. And the color coding denotes that, as I've said before, it's in the tropics and Southeast Asia where we see the preponderance of the reds and the yellows. These are the cities that are really in the front line of humid heat as the global climate warms up. So that's the present situation, but then when we factor in projected changes in temperature, atmospheric patterns, and the conditions in the oceans, we once again see it's the Southeast Asian cities that are becoming more exposed to these extraordinary conditions. So with just 2 degrees of warming, we can see additional cities occurring in Southeast Asia. Even at 1.5 degrees of warming, if that target is achieved, we see more cities where deadly conditions will be regularly encountered. And of course, the populations of many of these great cities are growing too, and with that, the cities are expanding. The growth of the city and the size of the city is also directly related to the strength of the urban heat islands that people experience across the city. And by factoring in the expected growth of population, the graph in the top right-hand corner shows how over the next 20, 30 years, we could expect to see an intensification of the urban heat island in many of these great cities. And then finally, in the bottom graphic, we see the relationship between the rise in humid heat and its impact on people's health. And here I'm showing through the dashed line the occurrence of conditions where even light labor is very difficult. And that's the point that's already been made, that extreme heat impacts both people's health and their capacity to work, their capacity to sleep and recover at the end of the day. So we need to take this whole picture approach. So onto the solutions. These can be seen at the city scale, the neighborhood scale, the building scale. So at the city scale, we might think about the possibility of including more blue or green space. At the neighborhood scale, we might be thinking in terms of incorporating more shade in the urban environment. At the building scale, we might be thinking about more reflective materials or changing the thermal insulation. And then finally, at the human scale, there are opportunities to raise awareness of risks, make greater and more effective use of heat wave forecasts. And we also need to support essential services such as reliable energy and water supplies. And then my final slide here is just a summary of what the science is telling us. There's not enough time to go through all these points. I just want to highlight 4. One is that the frequency and duration of severity of heat is increasing in Southeast Asia. City population growth is adding to the intensity of urban heat islands in these frontline cities, and that we need to appreciate that extreme heat can vary by several degrees across a single city. So we can't generalize on a city level. We need to really concentrate on the neighborhood house scale to understand the exposure of people to extreme heat. And finally, the point is that heat seldom operates in isolation of other hazards such as poor air quality. And together these can produce very difficult conditions for the most exposed people. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. That was really helpful. And I think just reinforcing what you said, it's about the scale you're looking at, and across urban systems, the scale, we get into issues of urban heat island effects, which we'll hear more from both Lenyo and Bijal. It is about not just dry heat, but also the amount of humidity in the system that's actually contributing to the risk. And in our region, we are actually increasing, the city populations are increasing quite rapidly, and that can contribute to further heat island effect and further people put in exposed situations. Before we go on to Lenyo, I think we have a question for the audience. So if you all look down below these, the video, you'll see there are certain questions. There's 2 questions, and I'd like you to focus on the first one. The question is really, is enough attention being paid to extreme heat in the city you work with or are living in? So it's an open question. I think I'd like to see what is the response we get, just to understand that amongst all of you. So I'm already starting to see no is coming up quite big, but let's wait for a few minutes and see where we are. And Rob, Lenyo, and Bijal, I guess you can also see the responses, right? Yeah.
I don't think this is a particularly surprising result, though. I think, as you said in your introductory remarks, heat is this silent killer. It's not as visible as the flash flood or the hurricane or the tropical cyclone. And that's perhaps why, as a scientific community and as planners and managers, we perhaps overlook this hazard because it's much less visible.
Exactly right. And I think, what we are seeing now is 25% are saying, yes, there is attention being paid. And actually it's changing, and about 4/5 of the audience is saying that it's not being paid attention to. So which actually gets us very well into the next person whose responsibility it is to highlight within a city the issues related to extreme heat. So Lenyo, I'd invite you as the first chief heat officer in Europe, in Athens, to help us understand what you're doing in your city. Over to you.
Thank you, Amit. Can you guys see my screen? Good.
Yes.
So we're jumping to the other side of the world very briefly. And as we all know, climate change has the big problem that we are realizing stronger and stronger all the time is that there is a very big gap between what the scientists say and what the people in power are actually doing about it. And so I have been working in the municipality of Athens, and I will talk a little bit about the history of what we've been doing in Athens in relation to heat and where we are right now. Of course, I'll just kind of start the presentation. So Athens is at the southeast part of Europe. The capital of Greece. It's a city that is surrounded by mountains, and it has expanded very, very quickly from a few thousand, like a few dozen of thousand people to 3 million people, 3.5 million people. The last between the 1950s and the 1990s. These are just a few pictures so that you can see a little bit, have a visual of it. It has, it's extremely densely built and densely populated. These days, about 80% of the surfaces of the city are non-permeable. And it also has a small percentage of green, and the green areas are unevenly distributed in the city. The eastern and kind of northeastern part of the city has very little green, and as most cities, this is a very quickly you can get a sense about where the most socioeconomically vulnerable people are. If you look at a city like this, a map of a city like this, you can kind of tell where the neighborhoods are that are the most vulnerable socioeconomically, and usually it's where there's no green. In 2017, we underwent a very interesting kind of bottom-up process where we created the resilience strategy for Athens and figured out where the weaknesses and the basic challenges lie for the city, asking the people. So it was very much a bottom-up process that created a strategy for 2030. And part of this strategy was, I think, did I skip one? Yes, we kind of identified in this strategy the major stresses and shocks for the city, and from climate change, of course, heat waves and the urban heat island was identified as one of the major challenges for the city. And so part of this, one of the actions for the resilience strategy was a climate change adaptation action plan with about 29 different actions that revolved around adapting to heat to a large extent. But it takes, part of also the understanding of the city at the time in 2017, where we had like the specific data, is that we had a large part of the population, around 25% of the population that was that had problems with energy poverty. So in this particular case, it's an issue of having access to a cooling to a cooling method of your house, like even if you have an air conditioning or even a fan, if you can actually turn it on when the heat wave happens. So the kind of climate, so this was, we all created that, but again, it doesn't mean that because you have a strategy in a municipality that the mayor or the people that are doing the actual works actually do these things. So you have to keep producing materials coming from the scientists or from different people to support what you're doing. So in 2019, there was a study from the Polytechnic School of Newcastle that can actually ranked Athens as the European single greatest, the city with the greatest impact from heat waves among 571 cities. And Moody's also announced kind of it through a report that Athens, unless it does something about its rising heat, that its credit rating is going to be in trouble, especially if, as the projections are that its economic activities are going to be quite influenced by the rising heat. So these are kind of, these things, along with the strategies, were important for kind of keep informing the policymakers and also the people that are to design and to implement things. There's several levels of people that you have to persuade and to explain why things have to change. So I'll talk a little bit about the specifics of heat risk in Athens. Currently we have about 15 to 25 days of heat waves in the summer, and we are expected to have for the temperatures in the decades to come to rise well above 25 days per year. Actually, they are expecting that it will be about 15 to 20 extra days of heat waves in around the middle of the century, and much less rainfall. We expected 2 degrees Celsius rise by the middle of the century, and 4 by the end of the century if we continue going the way we're going. And all of these issues of heat rising dovetail with the urban heat island, which means that exactly because the Athens is built so densely and it has so many hard surfaces, it becomes kind of, as Roy said, it becomes it captures heat and kind of radiates it during the night. And basically in Athens, we have the center of the heat of the city, exactly because it's so densely built, have much higher temperatures than the outskirts of the city. And the temperatures change from 5 degrees during the day to 10 degrees during the night. We have about 200 deaths per year that are related to heat. Electricity needs increase by 4.1% per degree of temperature that rises. Also, commercial activity declines. We also have like a series of insects and fungi that are starting to attack our trees, which are our main shield. And we have the problem that with very kind of low humidity because of extended heat waves that we have, which are not, which do not have much humidity, we have an extraordinary dry conditions that create the perfect conditions for large urban, peri-urban forest fires, wildfires, which this summer we experienced again, this summer. As Roy said, July was one of the hottest ever recorded. We had an extraordinary heat wave with a lot of peri-urban fires, and we lost a lot of people. 2.3 thousand people lost their lives in a course of 3.5 weeks in Greece. So we did this geospatial correlations in 2017, where you kind of we measured during one day of extreme heat where the areas that are most burdened by it, and we also kind of figured out the percentage of children that live in different neighborhoods, which is on the left, and on the right we measured the populations that through their zip codes that live in under poverty level, and we tried to create to make clear where the areas that of priority and vulnerability should be for all of the different projects of the city. And this year we created this map, which is a much more detailed map. It's for each block. We really know 5 years back, which is in the center here, 5 years back, what the type of heat, the mean of the different temperatures, surface temperatures have been in the last 5 years. So we have a much more detailed map. And don't get confused by the green and the blue, because it's like the green is 35, the blue is 35, the green is 38 degrees Celsius of surface temperature. And now we're trying to get more clear, again, like a renewed, updated socioeconomic data to overlay on this. And we also are trying to figure out issues that have to do with air conditioning and how many of the homes in which areas have air conditioning and where is the energy poverty more directly. So we're upgrading our climate action plan, which has like a lot of emphasis on heat mitigation and but also flash flooding, which is another big issue, and biodiversity loss, and et cetera, focusing a lot on green and blue infrastructure and sustainable water management. But the main things, the main 3 areas that I've been focusing on since I've been given this title has been like in 3 kind of big buckets, which one is awareness raising, the second one is emergency response during the heat wave, and the third one is how to cool the city. So awareness raising, as Amit kind of mentioned recently, we are really working between the different scientists in Athens and the scientists in the Arst Rockefeller Resilience Center, from the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, the scientific committee are working together with Greek meteorologists to actually start this summer naming and ranking of heat waves, which we really believe that it's going to make a very big difference for also policymakers, but also just the media to communicate what kind of dangers come with heat waves. We also have an application that we have developed, which you can download on your phone, and it gives you personalized real-time risk where you are and where to go, where is the nearest area that you can go, which is a cooling spot. This is just an example of the type of stuff that I've been working on. And then we have to we are now in the process of creating a task force and a robust kind of emergency response action plan, because we really have to become much better in figuring out how to support the people that are the most vulnerable during the heat waves, and how to actually reach them where they are, rather than just kind of opening cooling spots or directing them to places that they can find cover. And finally, because my time is going up, the whole thing is like, how can we cool the city? So we have a series of different efforts to create green nature-based solutions and green and blue infrastructure in the city, so that we can really talk about making the city more livable and viable and cooler in the future. So this is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lenio, I know that was really, really quick, but you provided a really nice summary of how, as a city, you've been thinking about heat over the last few years. And this is the methodological approach of, understanding vulnerability, understanding, the whole issue of green space and equity. I thought the point that you emphasized, where you can see on an area where there's lack of green, chances are that's hotter, and chances are there are more vulnerable people living in that location. So I think that link it was helpful to see. And also the issue of energy poverty. And it's one thing to say you might have an AC, and it's one thing to say you might have a fan, but if there's no electricity, you can't use them during a heat wave. So, those systems, how they link to each other is also something that's incredibly important. Thanks, Lenio, and we'll come back to some discussions afterwards. But now I'd like to invite Bijal. Bijal, we're really looking forward to hearing from you what you're doing on the ground with people on the ground. So over to you. You're on mute, Bijal. Still on mute, Bijal.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my name is Bijal Brambar, and as Amitji said, I work with an organization, Mahila Housing Trust, and we are based in India. And we work with poor women in informal settlements, trying to improve their housing, living, and working conditions. And the informality across the global south lives in actually 190 million population across the global south lives in such informal slum settlements. And while we were working on housing and habitat development issues, we realized that, climate change, the impacts of climate change are getting worsened because of the kind of, settlements that they are living in, because of the kind of built environment that the city generates and that the poor live in. And that's the reason we started working on the intersection of climate change and the poor and the built environment. Sorry, I'm trying to bring the next slide, but somehow it's not working. Download. I think so far as the global south and especially India is concerned, there has been a lot of concentration on poverty as being rural till now, till almost 2005. And so urban and urban poverty are now being recognized because we are urbanizing at a very fast pace. About 50% of India's population, 40 to 50% is going to live in small towns and cities now by 2030. And of them, there are, I mean, regarding climate change, there will be shocks and stresses. But what we understood is that long-term stresses are, which are really abstract, I mean, heat is a real given in India. And if it increases by 1 or 2 degrees in a day, people just don't realize because it's always there, kind of there. So people don't realize the impacts. So I think working on stresses for the poor and the city in general is much more, difficult because it's abstract. It's not very physically seen, and added to that was the gender discrimination because all these women that we work with actually use their house as their workplace. So they use it as a go down, they use it as a production house. They don't have a separate factory. So if you are a vendor, you really bring your vegetables or you produce your goods at your home and only the selling part happens outside. So, and they have least access to information, resources and assets. And of course, if you have health inequities or health incidents are increased due to heat stress, then again, it's the women who bear the burden of the dual care. So we actually, while working, identified the stresses and which were actually the heat stress. The water and vector-borne diseases are actually going to increase because of heat and humidity, as Leonie also said in her presentation. Water scarcity is going to increase and flooding and inundation across cities is going to increase. We started initially working with these issues on 7 cities in India, Nepal and Bangladesh, 100 slum settlements, almost 25,000 vulnerable families. So when we actually started working with them, so for most of the poor women, actually climate change, as I said, was merely God's act. So people did not understand what was climate change, what was its impact. And so we had to start targeted training and localized communication behavior. I think the other issue with the poor generally is that, the poverty makes them so vulnerable that with the limited kind of economic resources that they have, they choose to concentrate on the immediate needs like access to water, sanitation, or education for children, but do not probably want to invest in long-term and abstract things, as I'm saying, like heat stress. So we had to undertake intense communication. We had to actually unplug the scientific information, unpack it, and bring it to them in a language that they would understand. The next thing that we did was also in terms of heat stress. Now I'm talking only about heat stress. Was piloting and community validation of technical solutions related to heat stress and how they would be able to mitigate it. To us, what was very important was that the poor accept these technologies because obviously, they can't use an air conditioner. So, and the test of the acceptance was that they are ready to invest into the technologies. And for them to invest, of course, we have to design and incubate financial solutions, which is what we did, and then create strong institutional partnerships with city governments, scientists, technologists, and we created groups at the city level, which kept on meeting on these issues, particularly heat stress, over a period of time. So just to see, as I said, God's act, we did a snake and ladder game, made them easily understand how their, so several communication tools were devised, which were really very relevant and how their vulnerability was increasing. So the first thing that we did was make them realize their vulnerabilities and the stresses that were making them more vulnerable. So, how things have changed over the years, the 10 years, then 5 years, and then what's happening now in terms of heat, for example. One very interesting exercise that I would really like to describe to you is, you have to be, as I said, really explain this scientifically to them. And how do you unplug the science? So for them to explain the systems thinking approach around which, climate change works, We have not done this for heat. We would like to, but this one is for water. So here is what we did. We sort of drew up a water cycle on how the water is being impacted. So for example, evaporation, then runoff, then groundwater absorption. And then each important element was put on a yellow paper here. And then they were all put on a rope, and the ropes were held by the women. And then one node, if it was pulled, so one yellow or pink paper, if it was pulled, all the other got pulled. And that's how we explain the systems thinking approach to this poor women. And mind you, this is not only about poor. Generally, we have understood that the general public, the middle class, the elite within the city don't really understand the nuances of climate change, even within the city city corporations or the city governments. The next thing was to validate technical solutions. We actually started concentrating on roofing because most urban slums will have tin sheet and AC sheet roofing, which brings in highest amount of heat stress. So as compared to outside, if you go inside the houses, it's 5 to 6 degrees hotter. So here is a cool roof technology. What I would like to, this is a mod roof, what we call a mod roof done by a company. What we did is, this is the original shape. So you will see it had corrugations here. It was used as a slanting roof manufactured for a slum. And this is the tin sheet that the people were using. We actually convinced the women to open up their house, do this pilot, and then trained them to measure the heat inside their houses through temperature loggers themselves and compare it to the Indian Meteorological Department temperatures, which were prevalent outside. They then understood that the roof was really cooling, and then they became the mouthpiece. I mean, I found that, this physical, though slow, but that's the best way to actually market this within the poor. But what was important was that there were also disruptive collaborations. So they went back to the technologist and told him that for them to invest, they would like this roof, which is now in this form, the corrugations to disappear, also to be able to use it in a flat manner so that they can climb up and use it in a terrace. Now, people use terrace in the absence of an air conditioner in warm countries to just sleep on in the evening, because then it becomes very cool and you get the breeze. That was the request. And once, this happened, they actually invested huge money. So to the tune of $1,500. Loans of that tune were taken by them to adopt this technology. And you see the urban slums here, they are locked on all sides by other houses. So no ventilation is another big issue. So then we look some technologies that we did, for example, a rooftop ventilation to ensure circulation of air, thermal comfort and heat. Now green roofing, which already exists traditionally, but was disappearing. This will also give food security. Solar reflective white paint. Thermocol roof is an inside the house technology. We later on discontinued because it's very prone to fire. But people were also accepting this because it is very aspirational and looks very glamorous if done well. This is a processed bamboo roof. So people do use bamboo in its natural form in huts across India and global south, wherever it's available. But this is a much processed form to reduce heat and also make it look very glamorous with a company called Eco Shelter. These are some of the innovations that we did in terms of, technologies. Now, our observation here in terms of the poor accepting the technology is not only the, the cost. So we understood that 4 things really determine the way how the poor will adopt these technologies and invest in it. One, it's accessibility. Second is that it has to be aspirational. So, I mean, the uptake for the mod roof was much more, although it was the costliest as compared to solar reflective heat, which is, the least costly. This cost is like $1/4 a dollar per square feet. And that of the roof that I showed you earlier was somewhere around $5 per square feet. So I think affordability was not the only criteria that they invested into the technology. It was accessibility, affordability, aspirational, and user friendliness with the availability of finances. That is what determined their behavior change. So that's the first learning that we had. And then initially when we started this work, it was only for a period of 2 years under a project. Of course, now it's been 6 years and we are continuing. But after 2 years, only 2 years of time, when we made a longitudinal study, we understood that 96% of the people, of the 25,000 families that we had contacted, 96% recognized that climate change is man-made, which is a big achievement. And then 8% of the people introduced to the concepts adopted green roof technologies. 4% of households adopted white paint solutions. 7% had initially adopted thermocol-based ceiling. We are discontinuing it now. So only within a span of 2 years, there was behavior change which incurred and got the poor to invest. And there was definitely a link between the building of social capital that we had done and development of community-led climate resilient solutions, which we are going to explore further. Okay, so now here is some other work that we have been doing apart from, but actually links with the heat stress work that we had started. So what we realized is that India is currently having a big affordable housing program across the country where 20 million housing is going to be developed. And all these affordable housing which was being developed was not considering heat or energy as one of the important aspects. Just because, you know, India is a poor country, and which is what happens in most poor countries, that you are generating huge built environment, but it won't talk to the climate change impacts. Primarily because, if you adopt climate resilient or climate mitigation measures, it should not increase the costs. You are a poor country. Otherwise, the housing ministry will not talk to the climate change or energy ministry. So we took up this, we had the poor moving from the slums to these affordable housing, and we found that, the energy expenses were increasing about 3 to 4 folds. So we conducted a survey monitoring energy consumption and environment. So it was a thermal comfort survey that we did with the residents every week over different periods of time in a day. This was with the CEPT University. And we started evaluating their thermal comfort and energy consumption. And then the challenge was to, India does have an energy code, but it doesn't suit the needs of the poor because it doesn't actually apply beyond houses. I mean, lower down to houses which are, it only applies currently to houses which are of a size of 250 square meters, and not even the middle class in India will have housing of that size because it's huge population and land is a constraint in urban areas. So it doesn't apply to the poor housing, which is 25 square meters or 30 square meters typically as given by the government. So what could you actually do to reduce the heat gain and kind of produce an alternative energy code for the poor, which is not in vogue and not been adopted, but just to show the way. So we focused on reducing heat gain and loss and utilizing natural ventilation and daylighting to reduce peak indoor temperatures based on this survey and improve thermal comfort and reduce energy consumption. And that was by just to not add on more to cost, things like, what were the walling materials, that were being used. So what was the, value of, that's something called the U value of the walls that we measure. Simple things in passive design like window to wall ratio will really impact heat. Then the kind of glass that was being used was very, very important. They were using glass, but what kind is really very important for the heat. And by the way, in India, across India and global South, in emulation of the West, use of glass is becoming increasingly there in the kind of buildings that we develop, primarily because, it's cheaper for the developers, and it's actually extremely inappropriate because the West uses the glass to capture the heat or have more light, and we have no need to do that. But, it's something that we need to bring into the kind of building bylaws that we have. And one very disappearing feature of Indian building construction is that we used to have shading, quite a shading earlier to the buildings, which used to reduce the temperature. Something called weather shades, which were projections on the window and door opening, and which reduce the heat by 1 to 2 degrees and doesn't have a major cost implication. So we went with this thing to the Municipal Corporation of Ahmedabad, where we are based, and we are currently in negotiations. But some of the private developers that we are working with have adopted solar white paints, mosaic flooring on the terrace, which is cool roof, and extension of window overhangs and buildings, materials such as AAC blocks, which are not increasing the costs much. So that's the challenge that we have to come up with for poor countries. And we are trying to keep the residential, something called the residential envelope thermal transmittance value well within 15 watt per meter square, which is what will make the buildings heat resilient. So for us, research is what is research for us, and what is the relevance of research for us? So relevance of research for us is if it's results and solution oriented and leads to a positive impact on the lives of those who are most at risk. Research for us has to be transdisciplinary and co-created through a collaborative effort with the users. And it has to provide an avenue to incorporate the learnings while they are being implemented. And so the kind of disruptive collaborations that we brought about has to be brought about when we interact with researchers and technologies and city governments. And what was the influence? Because Ahmedabad is one city in India. So cities in India are now increasingly having heat action plans. They are planned. One, it remains majorly as a plan. Secondly, it has a very huge focus only on health, but it does not have any focus on the kind of built environment, on things like economic productivity, on things like what is going to happen to already water scarce region because of the kind of heat that we are generating, is something that needs to be brought in. Because of our work with the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, the heat action plan, which was merely focused on health, started focusing on cool roof policy, and they invited us to formulate a cool roof policy. In fact, we have to work on now development control regulations, which will promote heat resilient the way we build, but again, very cost effective. And we are now planning to extend these policy initiatives to currently to Bangalore, but other cities of India. We have a presence in 34 cities. The advantage to having organizations like us would be that you really push the action and you feedback into the research to make it more relevant. And that's what city government requires. It requires research partnership, but it also requires action people who would really support them to take it to the ground. And with that, I would like to end my presentation. I'm sorry if I've been very fast, but I was trying to tell too many things in the same presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Bijolji. That was really very, very rich, and just showing the action on the ground and all of the different opportunities that do exist and the challenges. I mean, I think I grew up in Delhi, and I still remember how we always accepted heat as something that is happening every summer, and you don't think about it too much. And one day is hotter than the next, and you just say, it's hot, you deal with it. And how do you actually change that for people to then understand, wait a minute, today's hot, tomorrow's hot, third day's hot, fourth day's hot. People are actually starting to suffer, women who are working, using their built environment for economic productivity, there is a losses. So like, how do you bring that message up and communicate it to the policymakers? So I think I really appreciated some of those points you made. We are running out a little bit on time. So what I will do is I will ask the audience again. There is a second set of questions below the panel. If you can go and respond to that, we'll give you around 1 minute. And then what I'll do is I'll go straight to the questions that all of you have been posting and ask the panelists for their responses. So take 30 seconds to 1 minute. We have a sliding scale trying to understand priorities for these different questions. It'll be good to get your responses and your feedback. And for the panelists, I think you can start to see the questions are around vulnerability assessment, action planning, assigning a responsible role within government, but also categorizing and naming. So, communication, the science behind understanding vulnerability, the action planning, the institutional role. It'll be good to just get a sense of where people think priorities should be. As people are responding, I'll pose the first question, and okay. So the first question is, how can we consider indirect impacts, such as increased medical expenses or loss of working days, in the vulnerability assessment from increased heat? Rob, do you want to start with that? And maybe Lenya, you can help him on that one. So I'll repeat the question. How can we consider indirect impacts, such as increased medical expenses or loss of working days, in the vulnerability assessment from increased heat?
Yeah, thank you for that very important question. I agree, the indirect impacts are even harder to analyze than the direct, which have been neglected enough. But I think there is a growing body of evidence in the scientific literature which can help us. It shows, as I did in my presentation, that there are known humid heat thresholds above which people's ability to work and be productive declines. And there are a number of studies around the world that show that empirical relationship between someone's productivity and the humid heat conditions. And so that can be used to assess impacts and can be scaled up across a community or across a city or a sector. But we also have to, I think, take into account other indirect heat impacts, such as disruption to the electricity supply or the water supply, and how that impacts the productivities too.
Thank you, Rob. Lenya, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the last point that Rob made is very important, because it's an issue of making sure that the basic systems of a city are running, and creating, like, having backups and making sure that there is a diversification of systems that are the main systems that keeps the people alive in the city, which has to do with water, energy, food, basically. These kind of systems are often, they fall apart in periods of extended heat for different reasons, and transportation is often affected. Different infrastructures stop working properly, so a lot of logistics stop working properly. So these are issues that cities really have to focus on, and I'm talking about cities because cities usually is the authority that has to deal with the people on the ground during the moments that the problem is really happening. And I think that Bijal's really focusing on the notion that it's not really easy to get, and Amit, you mentioned that too, to get the people to understand also, so in a way, the social side of it, not just the different systems, but the social side of it, of actually making sure that you can mobilize people and make people understand that they're under danger is really hard. And the fact that, that Bijal was saying how it's really difficult to get these policies and these types of services to infiltrate into people's everyday lives and homes is really a big issue that we have to look at. So this doesn't answer directly, Amit, what your question was, but it I just wanted to say these things in relation to Roy and Bijal, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, and I think what I can also add to that is there are now methods being developed to understand economic impacts, and both economic impacts and impacts on people, that are starting to understand these, not only direct but also these indirect impacts related to various climate change risks, but including extreme heat. And we as a center are trying to do some of that as well. The second question, maybe Vijay, I'll ask you is...
Amit, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Also, there's a lot of great work done by city networks where they are creating these tools that cities can put different types of information in and actually get the economic impact they're going to, like C40 has recently developed one of these things that I think people could actually look into and actually use. So this was just something that's available out there that people can actually use for free to figure out what the correlation is. Sorry, Amit,
No, that's totally, and you're right, totally fine. Vijay, the second question is, as heat waves affect both urban and rural settlements, what is the reason to link it only to urban? So I know it's an unfair question, but I thought it's worth asking, why are we only thinking about urban in this discussion and not touching upon rural?
2-3 things. One is that what I'm worried about is that, well, of course, I'm focusing on urban because our work is much more in urban areas. But if I were to give it, sort of a global or a local, a country perspective, is that one, urbanization is increasing very fast, and there is going to be exodus of people. About 50% of us, very high populated countries, global south, are going to live in cities. The second thing is that urbanization is extremely complex as compared to rural, areas. The regulations are very complex, and then you have huge built environment which is generated as compared to the rural areas, because it's all infrastructure, it's all buildings, its transportation is heavy. So I think the impact of climate change is going to be much more, especially on coastal cities, and it's going to be very difficult to regulate here because of all the interlinks. Because on one hand, we must remember that the global south is still to develop, unlike the West countries. So, one hand you are talking of development, on the other hand, you are talking of how climate change is going to impact us due to inadequate development. So you don't have easy solutions because of this huge infrastructure being environment generation. And it's extremely complex. And the third thing is, and I have looked at it although in India, the recognition of urban poverty has started happening in countries like Bangladesh or in Nepal, there's no recognition of urban poverty as of now. They don't have urban policies. Forget policies on how urban and climate change is going to interact, but unfortunately, then it will be too late. Because when I went to Nepal and Bangladesh taking climate change issues, I hardly found any municipal, the only municipal area in Nepal was probably Kathmandu and Dhaka in Bangladesh. And others, there were no urban policies as such. There was no recognition of urbanization. So that's what is very threatening to me.
Rob, did you want to add to that from a scientific perspective?
I agree with everything that's been said. And I would only add that, of course, the urban environment has its own climate, which exacerbates the expected warming and climate impacts. So we've already seen, for example, that the urban heat island can add up to 10 degrees Celsius to temperatures and can cause massive variations in temperature across the city between communities. So I think that's an additional reason. And also just the sheer concentration of people and assets in such a relatively small area creates a huge risk when you look at it from that point of view too. And especially if you have these other indirect impacts, such as a disruption to the electricity supply, which knocks out the air conditioning systems, or as Linio was saying, if you have a forest fire in a peri-urban environment, that adds to the poor air quality, which also exacerbates the air quality conditions in the city as well. So I think there's a lot of good reasons for concentrating on cities, but also not forgetting that rural communities are also exposed to other forms of heat stress that we should not neglect.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Vijay. I'll go to our last question because I'm aware we're already running over time. And maybe, Lenya, we can start that with you. What are the possible solutions city planners may think to mitigate, reduce urban heat island effects? So maybe Lenyo, Vijal, and Rob, all of you can take that question and then we'll end the session. So what are the possible solutions city planners may think to mitigate, reduce urban heat island effects?
I think the most important solutions that city planners have in their hands is using nature to lower temperatures. So most of the cities, especially the neighborhoods that are whether formal or informal settlements, they really depend on very low quality materials as far as thermal comfort is concerned. So part of what can dissipate that is always bringing in trees. I mean, trees are the magic formula for heat, and so this is one aspect. But we can't put trees everywhere. Clearly, we can try to put them as much as possible. So we do need a lot of focusing on materials, cheap materials. I mean, what Vijal was focusing on the white roofs, for example, is something that makes a difference. We know that it lowers temperatures and it's cheap, so we could actually use it. And the other thing that we really have to focus on, and we haven't touched upon, and I'll finish on that, is that we have to really, and the reason I'm actually mentioning these for two examples is, and of course the third example is information, and actually kind of making sure that you have alternatives for people to go to for cooling and keeping their body temperatures kind of low. But the main one thing that we didn't touch upon very much is the fact that we are looking at a lot of air conditioning units being the next kind of the future and the next problem with cities, because as heat rises, more and more people will buy air conditioning or cheap air conditioning, and mostly, which is a very big problem because it basically will exacerbate the situation in cities with both heat and CO2 emissions and other problems. But so policymakers have to really figure out, as Bijal's last point in her presentation, of how to try to make the temperatures of the city and the temperatures of buildings lower fast before we go crazy with the air conditionings in the next decade. So this is where I would like to leave it.
Thank you, Lenyu. Vijal, over to you.
I think I would choose to rather talk about the approach and very two important points. So I think that at least in India, I have seen that, urban planners tend to sort of undertake extremely ideal planning. That isn't really possible in poor countries, and then it really gets whisked off because the costs are very high. So I think find out solutions and plans which are very, so cost is going to be an extremely important factor on how we drive urban climate change urban planning. The second thing I think is that we don't go for mixed kind of a planning solutions or approach. What we have is one ideal plan which can never be reached in a poor country like ours. I would actually go for graded planning methodologies, which I know that the action is supposed to be urgent, but rather than move in steps, not moving at all, it's good to move in steps. Maybe the steps could be bigger. So from where we are to where we can reach, and sort of have a phased approach to implementing the planning, and the plan not remaining a plan. So the planners will plan and it will remain a plan, but how do you make it an action is very important. And also, kind of have phased plans and graded approaches, which are very easily doable, and have steps not small probably because we don't now have the luxury of taking baby steps, but you can't really, jump. In our quest to jump from nothing to most ideal, I've seen that we actually never reach anywhere. Then it just gets arrested. So I think that's my practical observation.
Thank you, Vijay. You reminded me of, in urban planning, we learned about rational planning, which was the idealistic, and then incremental planning, which is, incrementally building towards something. And I think, I like what you said about phased planning. Rob, over to you. What are the possible solutions city planners may think to mitigate, reduce urban heat island effects?
Just two other remarks to add to what has already been said. So I think where possible, improving airflow through cities and making use of natural breezes and local winds to ventilate cities, and also generally enhancing ventilation opportunities, but also recognizing that in many of the mega cities we're thinking about, poor air quality is also a factor when we think about opening up homes and workplaces to air for cooling. So we need to resolve the wider environmental conditions around air quality if we're going to use ventilation as an option. And I think that the final remark is that we shouldn't forget the indoor temperatures as well. All the official records are based on meteorological stations at sites that don't reflect the environments in which people live, sleep, and work. And the point has been made that in many communities, the home is also the workplace. So steps that can be taken to manage internal temperatures, as we've heard about today, are really important, focusing on the home and those affordable measures that are accessible and people can experience them in their own communities to see what the benefits are. I think that's really important.
Rob, that's perfect as an ending. So I think we can stop there. I really appreciate all of you taking your time, and to all of the participants, I hope you go away from this session thinking more what can be done around heat, and do reach out to any of us. We'll be happy to talk further. Thank you for the session. Thank you to the ADB, and thank you to all the participants. Take care.